Thank you for doing this.
Of course, to you. I told you. Thank
I
you for
always,
having me.
yeah, I always love working with you. We're going to be sending out teacher invites for next year too. So,
Inshallah, yeah. I hope to be here and hope to be of service.
hey, we're almost on the internet.
Okay.
Brilliant. All right. Welcome everybody to your class for today. Very excited to have Sam Reynolds here with us, and we're going to take this jump now. We have done planets, we have done signs, we've done the history, we've done the astronomy with Gemini Brett and Naomi taking us back to the sky. We've even had an opportunity in here to have Sasha give us the glyphs. We've taken the planets piece by piece by piece, and now we're going to jump and bring in the elements of houses. And these are the components you really need in beginning astrology to start to tell the story, the planets, the signs, and the houses. So I'm thrilled to have you here today, Sam. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me, Stormy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so funny, if you had the opportunity to see any of our promo to get you ready for this next class, it actually said houses and angels.
Yes, we're going to talk about the seraphim and the cherubim in your chart.
We're going to have to, but you know, somebody else said Patricia Walsh, she was beautiful. She's like, oh, but we've got two angels talking about angles. And I was like, Patricia, big ups.
Bless you.
I bless you. Absolutely appreciate that. So some good Mercury retrograde business. So Sam, what's the plan today? What do you got for us?
So the plan is to get into, talking about the business of houses and rulership, which is going to tie in, even though the focus is going to be on angles, I am also going to talk about the intermediate cusps, which will include the succedent houses and the cadent houses. And then also to answer the question about which house system do I use, right? And then also the panicky question usually that surfaces from most students. What if I have empty houses? Like I have an empty fifth house or an empty seventh house. Am I destined not to have any children or a partner? So to deal with that calamity and how to better understand it, this class, I would say, is more beginner, intermediate, because I am going to make some allusions to aspects, which I think become important and essential dignities, but that's not the heft of this class. The class is really about the houses.
Beautiful. And remember, you guys, that first of all, if you have not caught up on all the classes, you can always go back to the playlist. We've got everything in order so that you can just watch them in order. And you can always come back to them. As we move into July, Rick Levine will jump in and we will jump into aspects together. And you can come back and then see, what you can always put together. So the playlist is built beautifully for you here at the YouTube Academy for you to do whatever learning you need to. So Sam, I'm gonna leave you to it. Have a good class.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again. So one of the things, well, first, hello, everybody. I mean, I know I can't see you. I usually like to greet every student that comes in, but I'm sure there's a lot of you. So what I'm going to say is also building on something that Stormy said. You also can draw on some of the specific aspects of astronomy that I'm sure Naomi talked about, but I did also watch some of the work from Gemini Brett, who I admire greatly, my Scorpio brother. So this is a great intersection point because this is where we're dealing with some of the astronomy and related to more, I would say, the thematic, philosophical, dare say even spiritual, but definitely topical aspects of astrology. So first, I should start off with what are houses? So houses are 12 topical divisions of space and time derived by the intersection of the zodiac, which is really the ecliptic, which is the imaginary orbit of the sun around the earth, with a specific horizon, meaning like at a location, like I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so at that particular point, and the intersection with a culmination point called the meridian along the north-south axis, which I'm going to give you an illustration of because I think illustrations work better in terms of grasping it. And I know this is something that Gemini Brett talked about and even gave you some cautions, like specifically like saying that Astrologers are, in fact, fond of saying that the midheaven is the highest point in the sky. Figuratively, it's not true logic. I mean, literally, unless you're, as he said, at the tropics. So I'm going to give clarification related to that. So the planets in the zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac, are more celestial. This is important to grasp because I think even though there is a tie between the zodiac and the houses are not the same as the zodiac. This is very important because I think often students will have a collapsing of the two, like the first house equals Aries equals Mars, and that will confuse you. It's not that it's completely wrong. It's more so where it collapses too much. The houses are who, what, where, and how they manifest and act on Earth, because the houses are also called the mundane houses, which also relates to, we might have also call them the terrestrial houses. They're not celestial. They tie in the idea and the conceptions of the celestial and bring it down to Earth, which is why I say down there, in earth as it is in heaven, or on earth as it is in heaven, drawing from the Lord's Prayer. Houses use a different modulus of time and space than the zodiac. Like the hands of a clock hit the numbers of an analog clock differently. So for instance, when you look at the small hand of an analog clock and it's at the 1, and the larger hand is at, let's say, the 12, you will say to me, it's 1 o'clock. If the smaller hand goes to 1, you will not likely say to me, it's 1:01. You will likely say it's 1:05, because the modulus for the little hand changes in increments. So you can think of the houses more along the spectrum of like the little hand and then the big hand, right? Or the short fat one, however you want to look at it in terms of the clock. That's more related to the zodiac. So the modulus, the ways by which we understand more in minutia specificity, if you will, is more so derived from the houses. So this is to give you just a little warm up. This is not the complete configuration of how we draw up the houses, because one thing this does not include is necessarily the ecliptic. But it's kind of the orientation with some of the things I mentioned already, the horizon, the semicircle and circles of the north and south in terms of how we're looking at things. So we have nadir, zenith, and then this is again going more toward the south. This is just to give you the actual look of how things might appear from a mundane or the Earth's perspective. When we talk about a chart, this is how it can look. And we're talking about the houses. So we have 3 representations of houses here. And you might say like, well, why? Which I'll go into in a second. And you're probably more used to what looks like the pie or pizza pie one where we have the 12 slices. This one is from India, the one where my cursor is pointing to, and it's a box. And it's a South Indian chart. And again, it's another kind of chart. And one thing that's cool about these kind of charts is this, again, from quote unquote Vedic astrology, Indian astrology, also known as Jyotish. And this particular chart works where this particular box, the second box from the left, actually would represent the first house. And it goes in clockwise order around to, this is the 12th. And where you see the marking, that is for where you see those 2 lines, that's for what's called the lagna, or the start of the ascendant. So that's why it's also marked as ascendant. So you're like, well, how do you know what sign it is? Well, the signs are always the same. This is Aries, all the way around to Pisces up here. So this would suggest that this is a Scorpio rising. Now, this might be true more so from a sidereal point of view, which is a different topic altogether. Most of you are used to the tropical. And again, if you checked out Gemini Brett's talk, he talks about the distinction between 3 zodiacs, constellational, sidereal, and tropical. But this, again, is another way by which we can look at houses. And this one, which looks more like magic squares or a game I used to play when I was in grade school, This is also a way of looking at charts, and this is more from the medieval period, and was common before we even got more into the wheel. And this was starting from, again, going in counterclockwise order, first house, second house, this third part of the diamond, or what looks like the diamond, is here, and we see the numbers around the margins. And you might recognize the glyphs because the glyphs are pretty much the same. What's different is that the angles are more like what you see as the first, fourth, seventh, the centerpieces of the open square, or you might say of a pyramid. I also like to look at this as a kind of pyramid in some sense, opened up. Again, different ways of having a different kind of set of houses. So one thing to understand about these houses, and I am talking mainly about more so this circular wheel, which is what we're going to talk about more, but I wanted to introduce you to different conceptions of houses, is that we're really talking about of horizons and meridians of the X and Y axis, like you remember from grade school, where we have a horizontal axis and we have a vertical axis. The horizontal axis going straight along, which is, again, with that word horizon, the ascendant measures how we connect as individuals with others. It's divided east and west, the idea of the self related more to the east and the idea of the other related more to the west. The vertical axis measures how we establish ourselves in the world from family to vocation. It's divided between the familiar, which I kind of talk about more as the northern hemisphere, and then the southern hemisphere is more the unfamiliar. I'm going to go more into this, so if this is still difficult at some point, it's okay, because we're going to review it again and go more into it. So I just want to bring up, as before we start literally talking about the houses, I'm talking about the notion of the hemispheres related to the aspects of the chart. So just to be clear, we're talking about east, right? West from the 4th house to the 9th, which I made clear. And then we're talking about south from the top of the chart, first half of the pie, to the bottom half, 1st to 6th house, which is more, again, just to be specific, north. So the eastern side of the chart, where we imagine the sun rising, it's what's rising from you. And if you have a predominant number of planets on this side of the chart, meaning more so on the left, then we might describe you as more self-catering person, the person driven to view life as what I would say, kind of look at it in relation to food. And I know my Taurus sister Stormy can probably relate somewhat, is the idea of there's a la carte, where you can choose to make up your own plate, which usually costs more if you're like into going to restaurants as I am. You know, if you want to kind of pick and choose how you want to assemble your meal, then it's likely going to cost you more. So you can think of having a very strong, what we call oriental, related to the eastern side of the chart sensibility, means that you're more self-directed. What we might, if you're into karma, your own karma sewing hemisphere, where you're making things happen, but it's going to draw more out of you. It's going to quote unquote cost more, meaning expenditure of energy in terms of how you pull things together. If you're more occidental, more on the western side of the chart, which is the right-hand side of the chart, with the sun setting in the west, it means that you surrender to what's other than yourself and must share with others. And this is more like a prefix sense of the menu, where you have a fixed menu, and you can have an entree with all the different things that you may or may like, with some things that you may not like. Well, I wish I could get rid of the potatoes, but it's like, no, you know, the server says can't get rid of the potatoes. Or you could trade them out for mashed potatoes, but they still have to be potatoes. Yeah, right. Well, I like potatoes, but just to give you an idea. Now, what this means is that you're usually fitting in to like structures, collaborations, connections, perhaps established by others rather than dictated by yourself, which is more so like the a la carte. This usually costs less, draws less from you, but you may not have as much flexibility related to choice or your individual taste and or preferences. Now, what this means concretely and understanding just the rubric of your chart and these division by houses, excuse me, related to hemispheres, is that if you're more Oriental or Eastern side of the chart, again, I mean, I'm anticipating the PC sensibility because I've seen it before. When I say Oriental, it has nothing to do with people. Just to be clear, it's literally the classical notion of East. When you're more focused on the Eastern side, or your planets are more on the Eastern side, this often means that on some level, it could be difficult for you to work or fit yourself into someone else's agenda, which means practically that you may enjoy more either working on a long leash if you're working for somebody, meaning that you are not micromanaged, and you're given more like carte blanche to do a little more of what you want, even if you're supervisor, manager, something like that, or you're working independently, as versus Western emphasis, which would mean that you enjoy collaborating with others. Sometimes it may be difficult for you to take the initiative with certain things. Doesn't mean everything, but certain things. And it may be more so that you may struggle wanting to maybe at times even want to venture more out on your own, but there's ways in which you still have to connect or do have an emphasis related to connecting to others. Now, that's just East and West. There's also Southern and Northern. Now, remember, I know it's confusing because our inclination when we think about maps is top is north and south is bottom, especially for those of us who are more so in the Northern Hemisphere. Literally, when I say Northern Hemisphere, I mean like in the world, in the globe. But south is top, northern is bottom. And planets, when you have a preponderance of planets in the Southern Hemisphere, the top, indicates a person driven toward what's manifest or attainable in the world, like worldly success or acclaim. There's also a strong interest in what's familiar, like I'll show them, like you're all from Missouri and you like, I'm from the show me state and I'm gonna make it happen. I'm gonna blow this up, I'm gonna do this. You're more intrigued by what is different and distinct from your familiar backgrounds. Whereas if you have a more of a northern emphasis of planets, then it's going to be more so things that may be hidden away from the family, what's familiar, like your family, more your own inner world and feelings, and what we often term as your self-development in terms of dealing more with yourself. Not in the sense of being like the Eastern emphasis, but more so internal, not focused on so much the external. An example of this, now, I have clients who are well-known, who may have a very strong Northern emphasis. When I say well-known, like if I were to say a name, you would recognize it. So it doesn't mean then that you can't be famous if you have a Northern emphasis. What it does mean is that the fame may come or be there, but your emphasis is more on, you know, being private, more connection to your family and your inner world and those things. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're an introvert. You have to be careful when you get into these psychological classifications and typologies where you say, oh, well, you know, if you're more of an extrovert, if you're more Western and in the Southern Hemisphere, that may not always be true. It may be more so you're interested in things that are like in that example, Southern West or Southwest emphasis in your chart, that you're interested in the unfamiliar, but it doesn't mean that you're always drawn just to be quote unquote an extrovert. It just means that some measure of your interest or life circumstances may revolve more what's out there in the world. Similarly, just as a contrast, where you can have a high Southern emphasis, and even though you may be attentive to home and family, say like the chart of Ted Kennedy had a very strong Southern emphasis. So his life was very public and drawn to like being involved in the public, but also had the same sense of the family, you know, as the Kennedy dynasty. So why I wanted to introduce you to the hemispheres and to keep this running in the back of your mind is that it does become a way to help you frame and better understand the individual houses and the imperatives related to being the northern hemisphere, the southern, the houses like the ninth house, for example, why it is configured a particular way in contrast to, say, the third house, which is the opposite house. And houses, just to be clear, they operate in terms of opposites, ascendant to descendant, first house to seventh house. And again, even though these are not numbered here, it goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. And then 7 will be opposite to the first, 8th is opposite to the second, 9th is opposite to the third, 10th is opposite to the fourth, 11th is opposite to the fourth, and then 12th is opposite to the sixth by exact degree. And usually we keep relative, depending on how you set up your chart or what house system you use, we keep them equal in terms of measure. The sixth house, if it's going to be yay big, then it's going to be just as big for the 12th house. If we have using a different house system, what's called a quadrant house system, second house is really tiny, then the 8th house is going to be tiny. Same kind of thing. Okay, now we're going to talk about the cherubim and the seraphim here in terms of the angels. No, I'm sorry, the angles. So before I get into that, I want to clarify why I call the angles of the chart the best seats in the house. So in some spirit of disclosure and what might also prove helpful, my moon is in Leo. So a good portion of my life, as I mentioned already, restaurants, but I also love opera, theater, and musicals. So I'm not big into concerts, but I could be, depending on, like I saw Prince at least 2 or 3 times in concert, whose birthday is today. But this is the illustration, and I have spent a lot of time sometimes obsessing in terms of where to seat, especially in a venue I don't know as well, like when I would go to Broadway plays or musicals. So when you're doing that, you're trying to figure out where are the best seats that, one, you can afford, and then 2, just in terms of whether you can afford them, if you can, to make sure you're maximizing your dollars spent. So this is why you have this illustration here where, you have zone A as some of the best seats or quality seats, but the blue, premium seats, which you might say, well, why isn't it A? Because if you go to a Broadway play, like, especially if you have like a very frothy actor, you don't want to be in those front seats. You're going to get a shower, you're going to get sprayed. Whereas you just, oops, sorry, you go back a little bit, you have the premium. So the angles are like literally being in the premium seats where you can see, especially the ascendant, and be seen. Okay, so we're starting off with the ascendant, and here's the marker for ascendant, which is usually the cusp of the first house, depending on the house system you use, or if you're using more non-quadrant house systems, which are, if you're familiar with them, whole sign house systems, also the equal house system, those are examples of where the first house may be at the cusp of the, well, with the whole sign, it may be the whole sign for the ascendant. Like if you're a Pisces rising, then it's going to be the whole of Pisces. But let's say your ascendant, the actual marker, which I'm going to talk about in a second, is 27 degrees Pisces. So it's deeper into the sign, but the first house is going to be the whole sign. This is not that. This is actually what we call a quadrant-based system. So we have different cusps. We have even an interception. Scorpio and Taurus are intercepted in this chart as an example. I'll go a little more into that, but just to give you the idea, we're starting with the ascendant, this marker here, and it's at 12 degrees and 27 minutes of Cancer. So that's not like whole sign, that's a particular degree. And that goes into something that I want to talk a little bit about. The word ascendant is one particular thing, which is different from your rising sign. So the start of your chart is called the horoscopos, or the whole thing is called now the horoscope. But there's a very specific meaning for horoscopos, which means hour marker. So it literally is the point, the degree and sign that is coming above the horizon when you were born. That is technically the ascendant, and that technically is the horoscopos. Now, when you say your rising sign is, say, Leo or Aquarius, that's just the whole sign, as distinct from it being at a particular degree. So that's usually when, the astrologer asks you when you were born, what time you were born, and where. With that information, she or he can compose your chart, whether they do it by hand or by computer, and then they will get a specific degree. Now, that's important related to more the specificity related to understanding your chart, but that's what we're talking about as the first angle. The ascendant and its ruler signifies how the person steers his or her course in life. That's why I have this image here, because that was the classic Greek image given to the horoscopos as like how you are making your turns in life. So these two, the ascendant and its ruler, signify how the person makes his or her route through life, how she is perceived, what's important along the way, what are you paying attention to, what you rank as even the source of your happiness, which is more so the classical idea of the ascendant, and what she or she emphasizes. It's also the symbol of one's physicality, your actual sense of being. And when I say being, your body and physicality, and the modern notions of what we call the personality, how others may see you. So for instance, if you're a Leo rising, but your sun is in Scorpio, some may guess you're an actual Leo because you seem sunny and lively and fun and even a certain regal sense about you, but you're a Scorpio, right? And that's more, again, going into the depths of your sun sign, but this is what you convey or seem to show others. This is often, again, the cusp of the first house. So this is the first angle. Then we go to the next angle, and I am going to a classical ranking. The ranking usually was first house, given the most points, midheaven, then to the seventh house, and then last the fourth. I'm not wedded to this myself. I mean, I do use it when I'm especially using classical techniques, but this was, again, the conception where we saw more emphasis given to the ascendant, the hour marker, as the horoscopos, which becomes a horoscope, and then the midheaven. The medium coeli or celi, the middle of the sky, is what we say, and what we mean when we say midheaven. That's what MC stands for. It's not for, mix something or, an MC on the mic. Like the sun, it represents the highest point in the sky. The midheaven is not literally the highest point in the sky, but it represents the idea of your zenith, or the idea by which you arrive to the fullness of your being. It's the full light of day where everything can be seen. So likewise, this is how you have your experience of being in the world, having your calling and vocation. It and its ruler. Now you will notice something. I talk about the point, and then I talk about the planetary ruler. So if you have a Sagittarius midheaven, Jupiter is the ruler. And I use more classical traditional rulers. So if you're Pisces midheaven, then you may have Jupiter, again, as your ruler. Now, if you're more modern, you're going to use Neptune. Now, the midheaven, it signifies how the person establishes his or her reputation. Now, there's one particular caveat I want to make. If you are into the system of houses we call the whole sign house system, or if you're into the system of houses which we call the equal house system, your midheaven may not be in the same place as what we call the 10th house cusp. Your midheaven could be in the 9th house and 8th house, could be in the 10th house or the cusp of the 10th house. It could be actually in the 11th house, or if you're like Prince William, born at a very high latitude, It could be in the 12th house. His midheaven, if you use whole sign houses, actually ends up in the 12th. Not that uncommon. I'm not trying to make Prince William into a freak show. It actually does happen. But there is a way in which we can have a distinction between the midheaven and the 10th house. So I just want you to be aware of that, because many of you probably are more used to what we call the Placidus house system. It is the most plentiful, most well-used, most well-known house system. And there is no distinction between the MC being at the cusp of the 10th and being anywhere else. But if you start using a different house system, it can move. Now, you might say like, well, okay, Sam, let's say just for the sake of argument, I use whole sign houses and my MC ends up in the 10th, in the 9th house and my 10th house cusp. What's the difference? So the MC reveals more so how others come to know you. Your 10th house, if there is that distinction, is going to be more so related to what we might call as your job. You're like, okay, so let me give you an example. I'm going to draw from my own experience. Maybe you can relate. Let's say you have someone in your neighborhood who we will call Big Mama. She may not be big, like literally, but she is well revered and well respected. And she's a person that many people, young people, especially if they have young children, will call on if they need a babysitter, or she seems to look after the kids. She has like a whole array and get up for all the holidays. She loves to cook for people and bring things. She's just someone in the neighborhood who just looks out for people. So she's known as Big Mama. That's her reputation. That's her midheaven. That's how she's known. That's how we have the sense of her quote unquote sense of vocation and where she feels a calling in her life. What maybe most in her neighborhood don't know is that she has a day job and she works as let's say an accountant at a very prestigious firm, law firm even, in the not in the neighborhood, but in the city. So that's what she does during the day, or, most of the times when people like don't see her. That's her job. Now, she may not have that as her sense of vocation. She loves being Big Mama, and God forbid if Big Mama passes, then her midheaven, how she's going to be known, people are going to just talk about her more so as Big Mama. I'm like, oh, I didn't know she worked at, Anderson Consulting. I had no idea, or example, whatever I gave in terms of the law firm. So that is the way by which you can understand if you're using different house system between MC and 10th house. But for most people, the MC is going to be the cusp of the 10th house, especially if you're using like Placidus or any other kind of quadrant system. Now, remember what I said, the MC is in the southern hemisphere. So it's the zenith point related to the world that's unfamiliar, that's external. So classically, the midheaven was also the house or signification related to the mother. Now, this, for those of you who are at least have a passing familiarity with astrology, especially if you've been paying attention to more books from the 20th century, you will be struck by this because you're like, no, I thought it represented the father. Well, let me allay your concerns by saying one notion is that the 4th and the 10th house, and we'll come to the 4th in just a little bit, are more the guidelines related to the parents. Now, some have said that the 4th is going to be more the nurturing, dominant parent in your life, which I can somewhat agree. But classically, the 4th was the father, mother was the 10th. Now, you might say, well, how does it make sense for it to be the 10th? Isn't that more like related to Capricorn? Well, signs were not directly related to houses, so that's important to grasp. So that is a distinction, which I told you early on. We have more of the celestial, like, again, the big hand, and then the little hand, more so related to houses. So these are not the same. But the reason why the 10th house may relate more to the idea of the mother, remember, we're talking about the exteriorization, the materialization of what's in the larger world. Two things. The vehicle for all human beings presently in the 21st century is through a woman, right? We're not hatching yet. We're not necessarily, we can start the incubation process in test tubes, but to my knowledge, we haven't delivered just wholly from a test tube, to my knowledge. So the process is through a woman, and that often was a public experience, meaning most people in most of our human history and evolution would have a sense in the town, in the village, in the city of who the mother was of a particular child, unless that child was given up for adoption in unseen circumstances. But most times someone could see the woman was pregnant. It was a very public experience. And then again, dealing with the idea of the midheaven representing the unfamiliar or the externalization of what's inside or hidden, that goes along with what mothering does in terms of passing from what's hidden in the stomach into the world. So that, I believe, is one of the reasons why we have the midheaven, the MC, related to the mother. Now, that brings up a contrast we'll get to when we talk about the fourth house, the IC, as related to the father. Okay. All right. So I don't know if anyone has any questions, but we'll get to that more so toward the end, because that's usually where I have had students kind of like, wait, what? It's not Capricorn, right? The 10th house, again, like the other houses, like the first house, is not completely an analog for Aries. Capricorn is not, or the 10th house is not a complete analog for the 10th house. They're parallels, but they are distinct, just like we use the hands of a clock. Both can be on the 1, but have different meanings, or on a 12 and have different meanings. 7th house. That's also known as the descendant if we have the ascendant, descendant as the sun is setting. It's a balance point between the yield of night, the night coming, and the light of day, between ourselves and others. It describes your general one-on-one relationships with others, especially marriage partners, but partners in general, your business partner, anyone with whom you are in collaboration, active connection. That becomes a marker of understanding the 7th house, which you can also have a different kind of partner, which is described as open enemies, literally people who are your opposition or your opponent, whether that's in a court case, for example, or your soon-to-be ex, who's kind of lobbying more so for your wealth or resources. So it can be the person who, in some sense, opposes you. It also can be your general sense of your public, the public that you serve or you're connected to, especially if you are someone who has a public life. And again, this is the 7th house. And this brings us to the nadir. Again, this is often described or parallel to the zenith, even though it may literally not be the zenith. And this is the nadir, or more the sun's dipping. So one important thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but I think is important to mention now, is that there's something called secondary motion and then primary motion. So primary motion is the movement of the sun, which goes clockwise. And this is even where clockwise comes from. Much of the significations of the houses comes from primary motion, the movement of the sun going into the 12th, then the 11th, and then up to the 10th, being at the top of the chart, kind of falling, and then descending into the underworld, and then being sometime around midnight at its lowest point, meaning it's deep into the earth, it's pitch black out in terms of the darkness of the night. The night is fully formed, or at its apex. So that's what it's meant by nadir in relation to the sun's movement through the chart. And so when we get to the IC, the COELI, or again, that particular point, the sun appears below the earth, and it represents what's out of view, where we experience our sense of origins, where we come from, like our parents. Now, again, specifically the father, classically, the family in general, your heritage, your ancestors, and your home, where you reside, your domicile. And just to be clear, there are 2 ways by which we can talk about domicile, especially when we're talking about ancient thought. Your domicile could be your home in your village. Most people resided in their towns or cities of birth. So you would have your home, and then that could be your place of your origin, like we say Jesus of Nazareth. So that's because even though Jesus was killed in Jerusalem or just outside of Jerusalem, he was from Nazareth, and that was his historic home for his family. That was often true, in terms of how we talk about people from where they originated. So you could both have your domicile that is in your place of origin, or you could just be talking about your general origin, where you came from. So that's why we talk about two aspects of home. So for instance, just to kind of clarify it, right now I'm in my home, but my ancestral home, immediate ancestors, like my mother and father, to some degree, or family, Buffalo. I'm Buffalo, New York. So that's to give you the distinction. So that ties all that way in which we are experiencing, because another name for the IC is radix, where you experience your sense of rootedness. Now, another designation also given for the fourth house was the end of life or the final commentary on a question. This is more so true for if you're doing horary or electional astrology. And you're like, wait, why is the end of life? Because classically, as I said, in your home, especially if you were in your ancestral place where your family originated, there weren't necessarily anonymous cemeteries, where they're not anonymous, but where it was like communal plots of land. You were buried most likely in your ancestral plot, which usually was behind the home. This was true in early America. And, I guess sometimes people were buried in the communal plot related to a church, not just a mass cemetery. But it was where you had your final resting place. So the end of life is more so going toward that. The other thing that it relates to is that the chart was divided up into quadrants, where we have more so early part of life, like literally as a child, the first quadrant, then going with the sun's movement, the second part of life, which would be more so going toward young adulthood to your maturity, the third part of life, from the sixth house to the fourth. And then from the fourth, this was kind of more so going toward your final days, which would be senior life. So that is also the designation for why we have the fourth house related to the end of life. All right, those were the angles. Whew, you've survived, or the angels, right? So, and I know that was a Mercury, Mercury is playing with us. But one of the things that's interesting about that is that, angels, as we talk about them looking over us, really does relate to the idea of the angles, because these are the places that, in the broad sense of the term, look over us, but they're also the places by which we're looking through, whether we're talking about the ascendant, midheaven, by which we experience the world. And that also relates to the cardines by which we would talk about, north, south, east, west, which also relates to the archangels, and each archangel representing a particular point in the chart, or a particular point related to like the overall map. So one of the things I'm going to say to you in interpreting, and I think if we have time, I think we're doing okay on time right now, but we're going to look at some charts, and the angles really are where we have the heightened sense of action of things happening. Now, I'm going to anticipate a question, and I'm going to go more into it, but I'm going to mention this right off, because this usually goes into the question about, what about those empty houses? Like, I don't have anything in the first, the fourth, the seventh, or 10th. I don't have any, I have angles, but does that mean I don't have any angels looking over me, or, sense of guidance related to like having the best seats in the house? No, it does not mean that. What you do have are always the rulers of these particular places. If you are a Scorpio rising, then classically you will have Mars looking over that particular chart, even if he's not in one of the angles. So Mars, wherever he is in your chart, is trying to articulate about the interests and affairs and things related to your first house. Now, I'm mentioning Mars because I'm more classical. Now, if you're more modern, then you would talk about and look at Pluto. And then you would talk about wherever Pluto is in the chart and what he's trying to articulate, whether he's in your 7th house, which is angular, but say he's in the 8th, or he's in somewhere else. So he's the ruler. So you always have the ruler, the landlord, or the keeper, or the person who's in charge of maintaining that particular rhythm. You're always going to have that somewhere in the chart. So your angles, your houses, even when they're empty, are never without guidance. You will always have guidance once you can find the ruler of those places. And then we can get more into nuances of that a little later, but that's just the idea. Then there's the succedent houses. The succedent houses are the 2nd, 5th, 8th, and 11th. And I've highlighted them. Now, I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to admit to an error that I had early in my career. So when I was learning astrology, and I saw, we have the angular houses, and then I learned we have the succedent, I thought that, oh, they're called succedent because they follow after the angular houses. Like, well, this is a successive one after the 1st house, and this 5th house is a successive one after the 4th, and the 8th is a successive one after the 7th, and the 11th is a successive one after the 10th. That was wrong. Although that is kind of an assumed understanding. It actually is somewhat the reverse. Remember what I said, and I said the primary motion, the movement of the sun is actually going clockwise. Well, guess what? The houses do too. So if you're a Cancer rising, within 2 hours, especially in this particular case, because it's almost halfway through the sign, so in about an hour, guess what's going to be the next sign rising? It's going to be Leo. So succedent means that it is the next to succeed, almost like in terms of, Prince William or Prince Charles, in terms of the Queen, for the Queen of England and for the crown there. So there's ways in which we have the next come up. Now that gives you a clue in understanding succedent houses, because they strive to yield, hold, and maintain what's related to the previous angle. They are next to kind of maintain it. So the 2nd house holds the movable objects that belong to the 1st, like money, possessions, and resources. One thing that we can take from modern astrology that I really like is if we talk about the 1st house being like the first articulation of the I am, or as a child might understand it, me, then the 2nd house becomes the next articulation of mine. And it is mine, my Superman. This is mine. So you get the idea, right? That the 2nd house is where we have those things that belong to you, your resources, your money. 5th house holds the things that belong to the 4th, like things that relate to the children, more that is where you kind of have the deeper sense of self in terms of the 4th house. So your hobbies, your pleasures. 5th house classically is the house of sex, of where you experience that sense of pleasure, what joys one experiences in the home. 8th house holds the things that belong to the 7th house, like your partner's money or resources. The modern sense has us attributed to the 8th, attributed sex to the 8th, but that is not the classical notion of it. Won't get into it today unless you guys have pressing questions, and I can definitely elaborate on my preference related to the 5th house related to sex, but that is something to know that's distinct from more the classical pre-20th century sensibility of it. It also symbolizes as a Western house of where we're going toward the sun's, you know, entry into the underworld. It relates to the idea of the ultimate surrender, which is death. So the eighth house is more your sense of your death. I'm going to talk a little more about some things related to the eighth house. But one thing I'll say now, eighth house also relates to all those things that by which we have to give tribute for being alive. So it also relates to death, as I mentioned, but taxes as well. And it also relates by virtue of tribute, legacies, inheritances, things that you may get from others. So, like your parents' money or things like that, or your spouse's money, God forbid, if they pass away. The other thing that to understand is that I might say in a broader sense, the eighth house also can reflect those things that are beyond your control, including death and taxes, unless you can figure out a way to get around them, as some have. 11th house holds what you accrue from the 10th house. So these are your friends, teams you belong to, colleagues, associations, honors. When I say associations, like you belong to a frat or sorority, or you belong to, ESAR, or you belong to OPA, or you belong to AFAN, right? These different ways, by virtue of you putting yourself out there in the unfamiliar world, this becomes the experience of the 11th. This even happens for children, the first time they go into the sandbox, which is venturing from home at the playground. They're into the world of the unfamiliar, and then you may make friends there. That becomes the 11th house experience by virtue of you going through the quote unquote 10th house experience of into the realm of the unfamiliar, by which you allow yourself to be known in the external world. The 11th house also relates to a sense of social responsibility of any particular stripe, where I feel like I want to be more responsible for unborn children, or I want to be responsible for a woman's right to choose. All these different aspects of that can be very much tied to the idea of the 11th house. Things that may not be immediately related to you, but more so where you feel a kinship related to others in the external world. Also, your hopes and wishes. I had a hard time with that one because I'm like, well, why? Until there's a very good explanation for it. And this goes back to the 10th house in terms of the sun's apex, or the symbolism of the sun's apex. And that is, in our historical culture and cultures, that's symbolized by royalty, by the king or queen. And the traditional notion of the king and queen before we had more of the constitutional monarchy is that they owned everything. So all the lands, all the things that you wanted, whatever you wanted related to being able to venture out, had to come from the blessings of the king and queen. Very good example of this: before Columbus set sail for what we now know as the New World, he had to get the blessings or even the endorsement of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in order to be able to have ships and do the things that he wanted to do. Those were his hopes and wishes. So by virtue of seeking anything, that is through the supplication of what seems higher than you, whether that is the divine or your boss, being able to give you a loan, well, not a loan, a raise, all those particular things. So those are the succeedent houses. Now we move to the cadent houses. Now, a word about that image, because I've gotten a question about them. It's like, what is that about? Why do you have that? Bunk beds. I will elaborate in a second, but I don't think I mentioned, I do talk about what cadent houses are. So I'll just give you the image and then why they call it cadent. So that image is just an allusion to, having siblings. I had a bunk bed, and because I shared a room with my brother. And the third house, one of the things you're about to learn, is related to the idea of siblings. That's it. So the third houses are, the cadent houses are the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th. Cadent houses are those houses that fall away from the angles. Why? Because the word cadent comes from the Latin root cadere, which means to fall. And it's part of words that we already have in English. One of them is cadaver, which means a fallen person, dead person. The other one is accident, which is something to happen. So it's when something falls away from something. So if we recognize that the sun moves this way, going clockwise, that after it has reached its particular angle, it falls and goes into the next house. Same thing, 7th into the 6th, 4th into the 3rd, 1st into the 12th. So it falls away from the angles. So they are usually, these houses are described as the weaker of the houses. I'm putting that in scare quotes, and I'll come back to that in a second, because their falling reflects a changeable, unstable nature, just like if a king or a queen falls, for whatever reason, or, because they are overthrown or whatever, they're in a certain level of, instability. But here's a way we might come to think better of these houses rather than just saying they are weaker. They may be more subtle or subtler. They most often, per how I'm going to break them down, deal with knowledge and how we have the experience of proximity of one thing to another. So I'm going to give you a different vision of the cadent houses based on the hemispheres, and then something else I want to talk about called quincunxes or inconjuncts. The third house represents how you commune with those close to you and familiar. Remember, the third house is below the horizon and in the northern hemisphere. So this is going to be people who in some sense are not only close to you, but in some sense maybe like you, your neighbors, siblings, things that are more within your immediate distance or familiar to you. This can include short trips, messages, messengers, periodicals, but I want to make a qualification about short trips in terms of understanding the third house. It may be, so for instance, I live, as I mentioned to you, in Santa Fe, but I'm originally from Buffalo. Now, normally a trip, because it's going to take several hours, maybe at least 6, to get from Santa Fe to, I'm talking about plane, right? It's a different thing if I were driving. But from plane, from here to Santa Fe to Buffalo is a long trip. Could be considered a long trip. Here's the catch. Buffalo is very familiar to me. It's home, right? It's kind of where I grew up. So it's more in the realm of third house than ninth house, because it's a place that I have frequented very frequently. So that's one distinction. It's more so about what is familiar than just a qualification of what's, far. Sixth house represents what you do to yourself based on what you know and what's familiar, because again, it's also below the horizon. So how you take care of your health, your routines and the maintenance of your health in terms of taking showers and eating and regular maintenance of yourself. It does deal with the idea of employees, people that you hire. And we now, in the modern sense, which was not true classically, but we talk about it in terms of our jobs and job environment. I would say it's more so job environment. I'll make one concession in terms of the modern delineation for a reason. One reason is that our jobs now are part of our routines, right? So in terms of all the things that are necessary to maintain yourself. So that is more the sixth house and what it relates to. The ninth house represents how you commune with those far from you and unfamiliar, like foreigners, far trips, books and laws, ideas, religion, what's worthy of promotion, in terms of sharing with others. College is also, higher education are also under the ninth house. Now, it could be, well, I'm actually going to the local university and that is just around the corner. So why is that ninth house? Because the environment that you'll be in, dealing with different people who may come from different places, as well as concepts that may be unfamiliar to you, makes it along the spectrum of the quote unquote ninth house. 12th house represents what you do to yourself. Again, you see the parallel with the sixth house based on what's unknown to you or unfamiliar to you. like what you may not realize or take stock of, where you have the comeuppance for your misbehavior or behavior. In a modern sense, we often talk about this as the house of quote unquote karma, prisons, hospitals, large institutions, and secret enemies. I can make this very concrete for you. If you don't go through the particular routines of taking care of yourself and attending to your health, like if you have a piss poor diet, right, in terms of what you eat, then you shouldn't, I know this is a finger wagging, but you'll forgive me for that. Then you shouldn't be surprised that if you end up in the hospital for not taking care of yourself. So when I say it's what's unknown or unfamiliar, it's where you may act on ignorance, even though you may know better, but you're not practicing better. And it's the assumption that if you know better, you'll do better. Another example I can give you, sidebar, but related. One of my side interests, my fifth house interest, is crime. Not committing it, studying crime and criminals. And it's because I've always been fascinated. I think in another world, parallel universe, I'm a detective. And one of the things that interests me that I see repeatedly is how criminals will often commit crimes and then seem indignant and in disbelief that they're in prison. Like, I shouldn't be here. Why am I here? You know, some, obviously many, are aware of what they've done and see the comeuppance of it, but some will protest and like, nah, you know, we see this also related to people who have committed crimes, like, no, my son would never do that, right? Well, maybe you don't know your son as well you do. You think you do. So that's more the idea of the 12th house, the experience of what we don't see. So this also includes secret enemies. Large institutions, because this is where you may belong to something that you also are dealing with unfamiliar parts, and all parts of it you don't know. This is like the military, or yes, it could be like as large as a university, depending on the university, or as large as like IBM or a corporation like that. So these are again, the, well, these actually are supposedly the bad houses. So let me clarify. So this is the 6th, 8th, and 12th houses. So these houses are deemed the quote unquote bad houses, scare quotes. I want to explain why they have this reputation. You may see this in some astrology books, because they deal with things that are undesirable. Death. So the 6th house was classically the notion of illness. I scrubbed it a lot, you know, in the modern sense, because when you read about it in books before the 20th century, it was not known as the house of health and routines. It was like sickness, illness, blah, blah, blah. So death, illness, or getting locked up, which is more 12th house. You notice that all 3 houses have what we call a quincunx to the ascendant, or what I should say, an inconjunct. So let me explain that for those of you who are not familiar with aspects, which is cool, it's fine. So a quincunx or an inconjunct is when a planet or a point has a 30-degree or 150-degree relationship to another point. So in this case, both this point, the 6th house cusp, the 8th house cusp, are 150 degrees from the ascendant. Let's count them. Each degree, each house represents 30 degrees. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Putting us at the cusp of the 6th. We go this way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know why I'm doing this like the count from Sesame Street, but you're rolling with it. So we have here, we go to the cusp of the 8th house. So these are both, even though we call them sextile to each other, they're 150 degrees from the ascendant. I will clarify why this is important in a second. This particular point is only 30 degrees. So you're like, well, why is that? That's an inconjunct, meaning that you have another problem. Well, what's the problem? Planets that are said to be inconjunct, 150 degrees or 30 degrees, are blind spots for us. So for those of you who drive, you may be familiar with this concept, because you know that you just cannot rely, or you should not rely, on your rear view mirror or your passenger side mirror in order to make, let's say, a right turn. Why? You shouldn't just rely on them. You should also look. Well, why? Because there's a blind spot near the passenger's door where someone could be on your right, and as you're making a turn, you're cutting them off or you're going toward a collision. So you have to look. That's an example of like having the blind spot related to your 8th, your 6th, and then even toward your 12th house. So these particular houses represent where you have the experience of these blind spots. So the way I make the designation is then, what do these blind spots really relate to? Well, the 8th house is more the cost of life. Like you might remember I said, this is the place where you have to pay tribute in some way in terms of understanding from your ascendant what the cost of life is. So the cost of life is death. We will all die at some particular point. I hope it's much later for all of you, including myself, but we are all going to expire. So as part of the deal of being born at the ascendant point, which is what that represents, you will deal with the 8th house. Then the 6th house is a cost of living. In order to stay alive and have a certain quality of life, you must maintain your life a certain way. You must have particular routines. You have to do particular things in order to have these things, or you must have people, a retinue, which sounds a lot like routine if you kind of change the words around. You have a retinue of people who help maintain whatever you establish related to, your sense of identity. So retinue, if you were an aristocrat, you would have servants, you would have people. Now we have more employees, or, I have assistants or whatever who help maintain the level of what I call is my identity. And the 12th house, I call the price of living. So that's the cumulative aspect of that. Now you may say, like, well, what's the difference between cost of living and price? Aha, I'm glad you asked that. Well, here's the thing, just to kind of give you an example. I'll use this Fitbit. So this Fitbit may cost $200-$300, right? That's its cost. Its price, I'm sorry, reverse that. Its price is actually $300. The cost to make it might be $50. I don't really know how much it really costs, but the Fitbit owners know that maybe they spent like, $50. Let me set it for $300, right? That's what I mean as a distinction. So, the cost, what it costs you, what comes from you, but the price, that's the cumulative, what you're going to pay. So the 12th house is what you're going to pay from what you don't do in the 6th, or the net cost related to being alive, or being alive in terms of something that's more vast in yourself, or participating in something that's more vast in yourself. I could explain more about that if there are some questions particularly about that, but that's to kind of give you the nutshell. Now, I'm going to anticipate a question and then move on. The logical questions, like, okay, Sam, I know none of you probably sound like that. Like I said, these voices just pop in my head. If this is 30 degrees from the ascendant, why isn't the 2nd house also considered one of the bad houses? I think there's an interesting reason for that. But one, who's going to make money bad, right? If I said the 2nd house is related to resources, then you're not going to be inclined to want to say, well, I'm going to make that bad. I think there's another reason. So I'm going to go back even more to Hellenistic astrology. There's 2 gateways to Hades, which is interesting. So the other gateway is going into the 8th house, Cataphora, where you are descending into the underworld, or the sun is descending into the underworld, going into the 7th. It is dying. It is going toward its experience of loss. Where we have the golden hour, interestingly enough, is more so the idea of the 8th house experience, in terms of those of you who are into photography. What is happening in the anaphora, right? More so, the sun is gone toward its nadir and is coming up toward its life. So it's going out of Hades. So it's coming out of the 2nd house and back into life. So I think one of the reasons why the 2nd house was spared that rule of the inconjunct is more so because it is coming up from quote unquote Hades, the underworld. And again, that's my talk about the inconjuncts. Also, the 30 degree is called semisextile. And I talk about the inconjunct or the quincunx in general, reflecting how we have a sense of longing and how one experiences a cost for one's desires in general. We usually say, astrologers talk about the quincunx related to an adjustment, but I wanted to be more specific. It's an adjustment related to more so where you desire and want one thing, but you're experiencing a certain level of hardship or cost in another way. And it could be a simple illustration as dealing with this aspect of adjustment, could be something as small as a pebble in your sandal, right? Where you're trying to desire to walk and feel comfortable in your sandals, but you got this damn pebble and you either have to stop to get it out and somehow shake it out in order to have that sense of ease. So sometimes the inconjunct is where we have this serious period of, unrest. Okay, let me pause for a second and now start tying some things together and start talking about houses as if we were in a neighborhood. So one thing I want to drive home is that I think it's important, yes, to talk about the signs on the cusp of houses. But the real juice is going to be about those planets that rules the signs. One of the things to understand about astrology as versus signology, which I'll clarify what that is in a second, is that the real juice of astrology is in the planets. That's where it really all starts, the planets and the stars. What has happened with the advance of signology is that we've kind of made things more about the signs with memes and, if you're a Taurus, you're this, or if you're a Scorpio, you're this, if you're Pisces, you're this and that and another thing, right? So you have these different associations related to them. But really, when we're talking about, having, let's say, let's go to a chart here. You have Leo on the cusp of the second house. We're going to be talking about the sun and then whatever the sun's doing. So planets, when they have relationships to each other, or wherever that planet that rules that particular sign in the chart or that house, that planet has a couple things that's happening. One, that planet is always going to be interested, no matter where it is. In this chart, for instance, the sun is in Gemini. That sun in Gemini is always going to be interested in wherever Leo is in the chart, because the sun, quote unquote, rules Leo. So it's going to try to influence the houses involved by the sign it's in and the house it's in. So that becomes important in understanding one level of dynamic and looking at the houses. The next level of dynamic is going to be also about the aspects that that planet makes to other planets, because that's going to influence it. So for instance, the sun in Gemini, by virtue of its connection with Mercury, is going to be very invested in the idea of communication and talking. The sun also, by virtue of having this, what we call a trine to the moon, is also going to be very interested in having the connection to communication and, this between the sun and the moon. In terms of this sextile, even though it's kind of wide, it's also going to be trying to relate to Uranus in some way. So that's another layer by which we can understand what's happening in a particular house. The other layer to take into stock is that a tenanted house, meaning a house that has a planetary tenant in it, will amplify the affairs and issues in that house. So if you don't have something in the seventh house, but you got a lot in the first, those gaggle of planets in the first are going to have a lot to say. And a tenanted house may have more to say or have a lot to say related to your chart than the ruler. And you'd be like, well, how can that be? If I'm a Libra rising and I have a gaggle of planets or a whole bunch of slew of planets in the, or stellium, if you want to say, in the first house, wouldn't Venus have more say? Well, think about it. Think about your experience for those of you who rent, like me. When you rent, you have a landlord. You have someone who's in charge of the property, who owns the property. But even according to the law, 9/10 of the law is possession. So when you are a renter, you are in possession of the property, which is why, to the credit of the law, landlord just can't show up and be like, you know what? Get out, right? Legally, they can't technically do that. So they have to go through the court process in order to be able to retrieve the property. So if I decide, like, you know what, I want to color these walls fuchsia, I'm going to color these walls fuchsia, and I want to have, or I want to paint the house, whatever. Again, the landlord would have to take me to court in order to kind of, or the, the neighborhood, better, I'm blinking on the name right now, but, the community would have to kind of take some legal action in order to stop me from doing that. So the same thing applies to planets. So untenanted houses, yes, still have rulers, but tenanted houses have tenants who also are trying to express themselves, not just in relation to the house they're in, but also to the planets that the signs that they look over or guide or rule in other parts of the chart, say like the sun in the 12th house. It's in the 12th house with Mercury, who is the landlord of that house, but the sun is still trying to look over two houses, the second house and the third house. Now, I don't remember whose chart this is. I'm just using it as an illustration, but 5 will get me 10, maybe even 20 if I were a betting person, that this is someone who's very much invested in communicating and sharing information, because the sun being conjoined to that Mercury, who is the dispositor, or what we call fancy word for the ruler for that sun, both is invested in communication, and then looking over the second house where one has resources or gains money, and then the third house, which also deals with how we establish the sense of communion and connection with those who may be like us in some way, or we want to have like us. So again, I've already answered this question, but just to anticipate it, what about empty houses? Is there hope? Yes. It does not mean that if you have no planets in the 5th house or the 7th house, 5th house related to children, 7th house related to partners, that you have no prospects related to that, because you have a ruler, a landlord, someone who's looking over that particular part of the chart. This is why I say planets in connection with each other hold more sway than reading houses by what sign a planet is in. So, to go with just, Capricorn, that means you're going to have someone serious, girl. Capricorn is on the cusp of the 7th house. Well, that may be true, but you have to look at the ruler. Where's the ruler? The ruler is actually well dignified. This is a solar return chart, a Saturn return chart for whoever this is. And then the other thing is in the 8th house of other people's money. It may be that this is a person who has a good measure of resources. I'm also taking into account essential dignity, meaning that the planet is in its, what we call its domicile, its home. So Saturn, one of Saturn's homes is Aquarius, classically. I know for many modern astrologers, they also look at Uranus related to Aquarius, but classically Saturn has 2 homes. He has a day home and a night home. Saturn in Capricorn is his day home, his night home, and then Saturn in Aquarius is his day home. So again, that's to answer the question about empty houses. So what's the art of interpreting houses and rulers? Well, you're really going to be looking at these level of questions. Can the planet, and this is going to cover something that I'm not covering or I haven't covered in this particular course or class, and that is the question of essential and accidental dignity. So essential dignity really answers a question if it's like Saturn in Aquarius or Jupiter in Pisces in that example, or Mercury in Gemini. Can the planet deliver clearly and correctly the message that it has in the chart? Meaning that if it's in its home, can it do and deliver what it says that it can do? So it's just like, you know, if I were in your home, wherever your home may be, and I was like, could I have a glass of water? I would trust, and I would sincerely hope you have glasses or cups or something by which you could give me comfortably a glass of water, because you are in your home by virtue of you having the power to extend that level of authority to do whatever you want in order to kind of help me with a glass of water. Now, we would be in a different realm of weird if you suddenly like, okay, hold on, glass of water, right? And you went up and said, okay, yeah, can I want to get a glass of water. That would be weird. Where I'm like, well, isn't this your home? So a planet that is in its essential dignity, on whatever level we want to talk about essential dignity, there are 5. But the simplest one is rulership domicile, is able to kind of do what it says it wants to do. What signs and thus houses does the planet rule? Like I was illustrating with the sun ruling Leo. A house ruler is connected to what planets by aspect and how, which aspects, like I mentioned about the sextile and the trine. So we may look at that in your chart related to squares. Does a house ruler have tenants in a house that it rules? Meaning that, you know, like a landlord. So let me go back here with this example. Uranus is in Leo, which is a sign of the sun. So the sun is going to be very much interested in this Uranus. What is this Uranus up to? And what can I do for him or her? Does a ruler have tenants in the house that it rules? How does that alter the meaning of the house? So all these different layers give us clarity, ideally, and some clues related to what's happening in these particular houses. Say for this particular person, born April 23rd, 1968, 8:19 a.m., Western New York, Lockport, New York, which is not too far from where I grew up in Buffalo. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this person, since, you know, all of you are listening attentively, but maybe you can weigh in. And I'm going to give somewhat of a classical designation of this. Now, I am using, as you can see, I'm not using whole sign houses. I'm using Placidus, which is the most common and plentiful house system. And what you can see already in his 11th house is a Saturn in fall, because he actually is exalted in Libra. So this is not a good position for Saturn. Venus is also in detriment because she likes to be more so in Libra. And then the planet that rules all this Aries, including the North Node, is Mars, who's in the sign of Venus, which he doesn't like as much, and in the 12th house, a challenging house related to not having complete visibility. So you might remember that the 11th house is where we're dealing with affairs related to the idea of social responsibility, also the sense of friends and associations and wanting to connect. Now, with so many planets in the 11th house, this person definitely has a strong interest and imperative toward wanting to deal with those particular topics, whether in terms of having friends and being able to deal with people and connect, maybe to be part of a team and a sense of connection with that. But what gives us clues about that there might be trouble for him with this is that he has these troublesome positions for Venus and Saturn in, conjoined together in the 11th house. So this might suggest he might come off awkward as he comes up to meet people or try to connect, or he may seem distant. Someone comes up like, hey, how are you? I'm good. How are you? Right? So he may come off stiff or in some way in which he doesn't fully connect. So again, if we were talking to this person as a client, I might ask questions rather than assume like, you come off cold. What's up with you? I would more so ask, well, when people greet you or you connect with people, how do you normally feel? Is it like an encroachment, or do you, is it awkward for you, or does it seem awkward to them? Again, this is also designated by the ruler of his 11th house being in the 12th. So he has to be very careful of being standoffish. He might also be dealing with, with Mars being there. And then I go into more aspects, Mars being trine to Pluto and Uranus having this sextile to the moon. He may be dealing with, again, being in the 12th house where we have the experience of things that are hidden, or again, where we also experience things that are larger than us, even to some degree, what's out of our control. He may have some measure of resentment, anger, related to these particular, issues in the social sphere. And it could be very powerful. Getting a slightly off topic, but still related, we see corroboration of some of this where his moon is opposite to Pluto and also widely opposite to Uranus, as signifying where he may also have some roiling, deep emotional passions and issues related to some things that are unprocessed from him, maybe even from his childhood, and maybe even feeling bullied. And that might tie into ways in which he experiences association friends and things like that. So what happened? Who is this? This is Timothy McVeigh, who we call the American bomber who blew up a building along with hundreds of people in it and children in Oklahoma City. And he did it because he wanted to make a statement of protest to the US government. Again, that sense of social responsibility. And he was a former military man who sought to also get into at least a few different elite levels of associations and forces like the Green Berets, but really had a hard time connecting. And when I say connecting, also in terms of being on the team. The other thing to note in terms of what complicated his life was that he came under the tutorship of an older friend, Saturn, along with this Venus, who really helped stoke his anger and fire related to the government, who wasn't directly involved, was indirectly involved in the bombing, but who stoked that fire. And Timothy McVeigh was executed, but the man who really goaded him toward it is still in supermax, meaning maximum prison, and has not been, and likely won't be executed. And that's not me calling for the death penalty or anything like that. I'm not, but I'm just stating the facts. So some measure of his chart really did play out. Now, again, when I give this interpretation, notice that when I talked about it from a counseling point of view, it was not with the expectation that you're going to be a bomber, as much as here are some of the complications that are suggested in this topic or arena of your life, which is what houses are about. I'm going to tackle one last thing in terms of, and maybe more, because I do have where I have examples related to dealing with angular charts or cadent or succedent houses, but I'm also aware of the time, and I am going toward, I guess, the 90-minute mark. And I just want to be respectful of that. But I will say this, that there's a question that often comes up when you look at these charts. You will even see different rising signs. Like this one is from Uranus. So this is a different house system. This one is whole sign house system. And this is Placidus. And this is all for Dr. King's chart, Martin Luther King Jr. And this becomes important because you'll notice something. It's one thing to talk about, say, Jupiter in the 12th as versus Jupiter in the 1st, or to talk about a midheaven clearly as versus a midheaven in the 9th and in a different position, especially related to what I said about with the midheaven symbolizing more the sense of vocation, which you become known as. One thing that could have been true for Dr. King that wasn't, like you could also have a sun that ends up in the 10th as versus a sun in the 9th. So for instance, with my chart, if I do it one particular way using one house system called Campanus, it ends up in the eighth. As versus most other house systems, my sun ends up in the ninth. There's a difference between having a ninth house sun and an eighth house sun. So which house system do you use? Because there are all these different house systems, and these are some of the just Alcabitius, Regiomontanus, Meridian, Campanus, Porphyry. There's so many different house systems. How do you know? Now, generally the angles, except for Marinus, that's one big exception. The angles, first, fourth, seventh, and 10th, the angles, the degree on the angles will be about the same or be the same. But it's the calculation of the intermediate cusp, what becomes the second, the third, the fifth, the sixth, and then so on, and then vice versa for the opposite houses. That will be different. And all of these house systems are based on different ways or algorithms or trigonometry related to trisections of what we call the ecliptic, or another way by which we can establish a house is the prime meridian or the equator, right? So there's these different ways by which we might be able to measure how we're going to set up the houses. Here's my answer to you. And many students don't like my answer, which is okay, because they want, something more tried and true, empirical, that is going to work for everybody in all time. So I'm about to disappoint you if that's what you want. I would say choose your house system like you choose your toothbrush. Choose it as something that works for you in your chart and those charts that you consistently may come to see or you test. So experiment in time with what works for you, which I'm saying you might try to play with all of them and see what makes sense. It ultimately depends also on what you want, as different house systems are made for different purposes. If, for instance, when you go out into the night sky and you look at the stars and you really are into the astronomy of looking at planets, then it makes sense for you to use a Campanus house system, because that house system more readily draws on the apparent perspective from the Earth's point of view or your location's point of view of where the planets are. So if you see Jupiter and Mars are some distance from each other in the night sky, but you look at your Placidus chart and they seem like they're right on top of each other, most likely with Campanus, it's going to show a little more, not exactly, but that sense of distance. So it really does depend on what you're looking for. If you're into astrological magic, like literally you're using planetary hours and you're into aligning it up, then you may want to use Placidus, because Placidus is a time-based system that draws and has very clear parallels related to something called planetary hours, where every hour of, not literally hour of the day, but every time frame or period part of the day is governed by a planet. So for instance, today is Monday, which is a moon day. So at dawn, within the first roughly hour, it depends on the latitude and it depends on the time of year. So it's not exactly 60 minutes, but during that first part of the day of starting at dawn is the moon's hour, because we're in a Monday. And then that will go through an iteration of 7 planets, because we're using only the traditional 7 planets, which is not the outer planets of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And then it starts again. And then we'll be in a moon hour and go through until we get to dusk. And then we start at a different point. So Placidus is a system that relates very much to that. Now, I went to whole sign house system some 10 years back, and it's probably more than that now. I mean, I should update that. And I went to that because it spoke to me related more to my natal chart as versus Placidus, and seems to be easier to navigate and use related to other charts for clients that I register and who come to see me. But I also use a different house system, Regiomontanus, for horaries and elections, because I like to see the cusps on houses, which is not something you get using whole sign houses. So I actually do use 2-house systems, but I experiment still with all these different ones just to see, like, well, let me try with this. I've been doing a lot more work with components, a lot more. So don't get too rigid, but at the same time, and I will make one qualification. What I'm saying is not that you should experiment with if you do see clients or if you do see people. I'm not saying, well, I'm going to try it with Coke. You pronounce this Coke, by the way, it's not Koch. Coke and Marinas. One day I'm going to do Alcobicious for this client. That will drive you crazy and you won't be able to see and know consistent results. But what would be fair is if you kind of are experimenting and you're still being a student, you may look at a bevy of charts, say 10, 20 or more with Regiomontanus. You may look at yours, including yours, with Porphyry. You may look at yours with whole sign houses. Okay, I'm going to stop here and call on the glorious Stormy to come in because I know that I'm at the beyond the 90-minute mark, and see if she has questions, because what I was going to do is just go through with some sample charts, but maybe it was enough with Timothy McVeigh, and just see what questions people have and where I need to pick up things.
So far right now in our chat, our teaching assistants have gathered all of the questions so far. So far you were moving along just fine. Would you like to finish with your example charts, or do you feel
okay? But do they have questions or no? There aren't any questions. Everything clear?
Yeah, so far so good. There were a couple questions about empty houses. We got to that. And I suspect that typical to class, there may be a lot more questions when the class is over and then we watch the comment section. But so far, we've done good. Plus, I'm telling you, the teaching assistants are really good.
All right. So let me just go to that.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll go to from current slide. Okay. So when you read for the angles, I have 3 examples for the 3 kinds of houses. So with this mystery person, January 17th, 1942, 6:35 p.m., Louisville, Kentucky. I love this chart. I think I picked all of my favorite charts because we have a Leo rising. So that means we have to look for the sun. Now, if you use whole sign houses as I'm using here, the sun is very close to the 7th house. It's like 3 degrees shy of being at the cusp of the 7th house. Now, this is where it is sometimes confusing because when you're using whole sign houses, the actual descendant marker is 19 degrees Aquarius, which is where this Venus is. So the sun is not close to that. But the sun is still what we could see somewhat angular from just looking at whole sign houses. But what is definitely angular is the moon, the Mercury, and the Venus. So Venus is going to, and the Mercury and the moon is going to configure very largely in this person's life. When I say they have these planets have the best seats in the house, they're going to show up in some permutation related to this person's life. Now you might say, like, well, what about these other planets? Thank you for asking. Mars is angular in the 10th house, even though it's not exactly at the MC. So are Saturn and Uranus conjoined together. So the themes related to Saturn and Uranus being surprising, unconventional, but at the same time having a certain conventionality. But being Venusian, maybe something, maybe this person is handsome, maybe this person also being angular and opposite to the ascendant. And then the other thing is Mercury moon. This person may have an active interest in communicating with people and talking, may even talk fast, because when Mercury and the moon, the 2 fastest planets in the sky, are together, they often will denote speed and some means by which they have that. Now, what also stands out, and why I even have this Mars singled out, Mars has a very near square, tight square with Pluto. This X, it's not for the X-Men. This is for the lot of fortune. I'm not going to cover that right now. It's not a planet, it's a calculated point. but Mars is a square to Pluto, that can denote a lot of dynamic tension between what those two planets signify. Anger, the need to fight, the need to kind of prove oneself, especially with Pluto being in the first house in Leo. Courage, that's another example of Mars, Pluto, and grit, determination, a lot of energy, a lot of power that also could be demonstrated. The sun also has a wide square, very wide, because it's out of what we say, out of sign, dissociative, but that's another connection. Now you may notice, like, well, you didn't say anything about down here, the fourth house, right? Well, the fourth house, what's familiar, the anchoring point, especially related to Mars being at the top of the chart, that would signify that this person has a very strong interest in establishing themselves again, really it's that Mars-Pluto square, and being in the external world, again, proving themselves in relation to the world. It also may signify, by virtue of the Mars being in detriment, just like Timothy McVeigh, that in a planet in detriment means that there's some way in which this person is struggling to belong and may feel like an outsider, but may not recognize ways in which they participate in feeling like an outsider. Now, what can happen is that they may come to even relish being an outsider. You know, one of the things, because I'm glad for my mutable rising, I moved to Santa Fe, which is slower. So when people say mañana here, right, they literally do mean like it could be tomorrow or it could be next week. Now, one of the things I trained my mind for before coming here, as an example related to not going into a detriment state, is that I'm from New York, right? When you hear New York minute, right? So we often are impatient and be like, yeah, I mean yesterday, hello, McFly, what's going on, right? So I wouldn't fall into detriment here and end up like an a-hole in mañana land. I conditioned my mind to be like, no, relax. I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying, you know, I've only been here a month, but enjoying being more out in the Southwest where things are slower, moving at a different pace. But a New Yorker who just is coming from New York and very attached to New York may come out here and be like, wait, where's my bagel? I mean, I ordered it like 3 minutes ago. Hello, right? That would be like a Mars in Taurus. Kind of like, yeah, I'm having trouble with the slow moving thing, you know, being in the sign of Venus, everything kind of frilly and lacy and nice and comfortable. I don't know how I feel about that. So this may be a challenge for this person in this person's life. So who is this? Well, this is the chart of dun 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 Muhammad Ali. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. You know, and I think that's where we have this Venus. He has this gift for gab, you know, in terms of talking, you know, I'm the prettiest, I'm the greatest of all time, right? And he just knew how to live that leonine life. And then definitely, you know, he did have some troubles with the ladies. And when I say troubles with the ladies, meaning like necessarily keeping one, right? I think he was married 3 or 4 times, you know, with that Venus, Mercury, Moon. But the Mars, Pluto is definitely, you know, pugilistic. And one thing to know, especially if you're not into boxing, Muhammad Ali in his prime, and there's so many different layers and complications to the man, but just in the interest of time, he was an incredible fighter. And he was an incredible fighter, not just in terms of strategy, but stamina. There's a movie, if you're into documentaries or, you know, like that, I would recommend When We Were Kings, which is documenting his fight against George Foreman. And the thing to understand about, I believe it was Foreman, because I know he also had a couple of fights against Joe Frazier, but the fight against George Foreman, he was supposed to lose. Like, you know, in terms of just stats, you know, when fighting was really fighting, not like the sham we just had last night. I know I'm just giving my own statements. But when fighting was really fighting, you know, and odds meant something, no one really felt, because George Foreman was a bigger fighter, also had a similar record, was a tough fighter. So there was no way he was really supposed to win that fight, which he did. So that's also that Mars, Pluto. I mean, there's other testimonies in terms of being that Saturn, Uranus. So those things contributed to that, but that's just to give you an example. The succeedent houses. So this chart, I'm using whole sign, and he has a good amount of planets in succeedent houses. The only house that is technically empty is the 8th house, which is ruled by the moon in the 2nd house. So what this could suggest is that some measure of the partner's resources becomes shared or part of his own, which proved true. This person married his cousin in a time, note the time, 1809. I mean, don't get it twisted, and be like, that's nasty. I mean, we could judge it by our standards, but in his time, it was not nasty. He married his cousin, who came from the wealthier side of the family. He also came from privilege and aristocracy, but he also, didn't necessarily have as much money as her side. But so this is suggested by the moon. The other thing you might say, well, then he had trouble with money. Relatively, he didn't have to worry about money as much because he had money, and this strong Saturn at the top of his chart to his ascendant, along with his strong Jupiter, really helps in terms of angularity. But he had some resources, but he didn't necessarily make a lot of money, for sure. Now, what does happen related to his 5th house is that, you see his 5th house is opposite to his midheaven. So his midheaven does something unusual, or seems to be unusual, in terms of how he establishes himself. What does this mean that Venus is opposite the midheaven and rules it in the 11th house? So his sense of social responsibility would be keen and related to his friends, but one of the afflictions he may have with Venus also being in detriment is that he may not be aware of his own worth and then his own value that he can give to society, or he has some ambivalence about it, which I'll elaborate on in a second, which proved true. And then as a tenant in that house is Mars, which also is in detriment. Because this is a sidebar, but related. I love this chart, and I use this chart a lot because I use it as, when I teach about essential dignities, I use it as a FUBAR chart. For those of you who know what FUBAR means, you'll get it probably immediately. Those who don't, it's F'd up, just using with F, U for up, beyond all relief or recognition. That's what a FUBAR chart is in terms of essential dignities. And just to be clear, he has a Mars in detriment. He has a moon in detriment. He has a sun in detriment. He has a Mercury in detriment, or actually in fall. He has a Venus in detriment. So he has 5 out of 7 traditional planets that are messed up from the floor up using the idea of essential dignities. And I use this chart related to essential dignities as an example of one usurping the idea that if you have messed up planets, you're messed up, because this person was not messed up. But the better way to understand a planet is in detriment is that it struggles with belonging. It struggles with fitting in some way. It thinks differently. It behaves differently than what's around it. The other thing to understand with these planets being in succeedent houses is that perhaps this person also struggled with his sense of, how he held his resources. And I don't mean just resources in terms of money, because like I said, he came from aristocracy. He had resources, but more so how those resources and being able to share those resources, including some measure of his thoughts, may have been difficult for him and his creations. Now, one thing that is signified with Venus being the ruler of, Venus being in his 5th house, he did have complications, at least with one child, meaning that he did lose one child. He had at least 4 others or 3 others who were fine, and grew to adulthood, but there was a complication, at least related to one who died early in life. And even though Venus is ruling this house, Mars is ruling this house and in detriment, it didn't mean that his children were ruinous or whatever. In fact, because Venus could some sense see the ascendant, the midheaven, there's a way in which there was support. So what happened? Who is this? Well, first I'll tell you this. He has a twin. Not a twin in real life, but an astral twin. His twin was born in America, and his twin is Abraham Lincoln. This person is Charles Darwin. Now, why I like to use Darwin's chart is because think about in the 19th century, how threatening the idea, in the early 20th century, how threatening the idea of evolution was. And it still is for many people. The idea that things progressed longer than the 6 days that the Bible says, or that the world is older than 10,000 years. Had he been born 300, 400 years earlier, he would have been killed. And that Venus midheaven opposition manifested where he almost didn't publish Origin of Species. The only reason why he published Origin of Species, because he actually felt very concerned about the implications against social responsibility of what would happen if he published his findings related to what happened in the world's history. But the only reason why he published it was that a younger man who had been listening to Charles Darwin for decades, or had heard about many of his ideas, was coming out with his own book related to the origin of our, the evolution of different species. And his friends, that 11th house, said, look, dude, we've been listening to you. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. We've been listening to you for 3-4 decades on your findings, starting from when you were in your early 20s. And this guy is about to get all the credit for much of your hard work. You better publish something. And he did. And so that's why we know about him even today, Charles Darwin. And we don't necessarily remember or know the person who was going to publish that similar work. I even keep forgetting the poor young man's name. I learn it and then I forget it. But this is where we see, and this is another thing to recognize, if a planet can see the point it rules, it does have some connection and ability to be able to do something related to that particular point. So if Jupiter rules your ascendant, but it's an opposite sign, it still is of the ability to be able to do something for it. In Timothy McVeigh's chart, with the Mars being in the next sign over from the sign it rules, Aries, it couldn't do much for it because it's inconjunct. It means it can't see it. It's a blind spot for Mars, which is a harder position. Last example is this mystery dude, November 27th, 1940, 7:12 a.m., San Francisco, CA. Now I wonder if there's a San Francisco, Pennsylvania. That would be interesting. So we have really this bow tie effect between this crowded 12th house and then these 3 planets in the 6th house. So we have 2 planets in cadent houses, or 2 houses with loaded with planets. We have actually a total of 7 out of 10 planets in cadent houses, including this Pluto up here. So we actually have 8 out of 10. So why I picked this person is that you look at the dynamics between the 12th and the 6th, and you might say, well, this person doesn't take care of themselves. Well, I don't know if that would be true. I mean, there may be complications this person may go through because the moon is also in Scorpio, Venus is in Scorpio, but Mars is in this domicile, which gives him some level of authority. You might also know, as we saw with Muhammad Ali, that he has a Mars-Pluto square. Again, dynamic tension to anger, but also stamina, a lot of energy, a sense of power. Could also signify aspects related to rage. but all these things are strong. And he also has as a T-square. Again, aspects become important because they give us information on what we can know and learn about these houses, in terms of Venus speaking for the Taurus sixth house. So there may be some problems that may relate to taking care of himself, but Mars, by virtue of his stamina, sense of discipline, by virtue of also being opposite to Saturn and Jupiter, may take care of that. So who is this person? Well, let me give you a different picture as I reveal who this is that will tie in this 12th house, the 6th house, and then the square, even to Pluto in terms of worldwide fame. Note the angularity. The sun is also at the ascendant. So this is a person who's likely to be seen. And Neptune is conjoined to the midheaven. So what's happening here? Who is this? Well, the story I can give you is in the 70s, just to take you back a little bit, before we had the rise of Regal theaters and AMC and all these other things, you had more the range of pretty much local family-owned or single-owned theaters. And the range of those theaters could come from where you had, movie houses that ran legitimate, Hollywood films, to where you had movies that ran things that were more under the radar, like porn, or other kinds of movies that were not popularly seen in movie theaters. Well, long story short, I was about, at least 5, 6 years old, where my brother, my older brother, teenage brother at the time, had to babysit me and decides to take me into one of these more shady theaters to see a Kung Fu movie. And you might say, like, wait, so they showed Kung Fu movies in porn theaters? Yep, they did. A whole different ball game than what it came to be in the 80s and 90s and so forth. So, I knew it was very different than the movie theaters that my mom took me to, and seemed different. And I'm pretty sure my brother had no authority to take me to this, but the screen comes, lights on the screen come on, and then we're watching this film, and I see this dude going, making these animal sounds as he's also making these motions related to his hands in slow motion and all that. And I was fascinated, but I was like, what is wrong with him? Like, what is he? And this is Bruce Lee. And what I can say as someone who's now since studied Bruce Lee, seen all his films, have a good measure of veneration for the man, is that this is that high intensity, primal intensity, more the deep sense of being in touch with, some may say the unconscious related to the 12th house, or his daemon, with that sense of discipline and that sense of vim and vigor. The Neptune conjoined to the midheaven, Neptune classically suggesting film and related to film, and definitely being the star with the sun rising at his ascendant. But in terms of that intensity and spending so much of his life actually in studios, whether he was doing it, and when I say studios, it may have been a dojo where he was also training or working with others, or literally a film studio, especially as it was for the last 10 years of his life. Because I believe he died at 36 or 37. He died young. And it may have been related. It's very unclear how he died, whether he just had an aneurysm or whether he was abusing some drugs to kind of keep him active and alert, or was some combination, or he had a gaggle of enemies, 12th house secret enemies. And he did have people who definitely would have relished seeing him dying, because he was a maverick. He was very much bucking the trend related to how Kung Fu had been taught and to whom he was teaching it, to Westerners. So this was often frowned upon, especially in, San Francisco, where he not only was born, but also where he came to live. So this is my class. I thank you for these 2 hours that we've had together. My information is there, unlockastrology.com, my email. I'm unlockastro on Twitter and SF Reynolds on IG, Instagram. So thank you, Stormy.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was like so good. I knew it was going to be good though. I always enjoy having you over and the way that you kind of peel things out. So thank you too for coming, and the chat box is awesome. People are still talking, and there will be comments afterwards as well. So we'll be able to look back and answer those. So if you do have questions and you're watching on the replay, or you thought of something as you were in class, and of course now it's over, put it in the comment section down below. Myself, Sam, the assistants, everybody will be answering questions for you. Remember, we answer questions on Wednesdays and Saturdays. And if you don't see your question or your comment pop up right away, we release them every day so that we can filter out all the spam comments as well. So don't worry, we got it, and we're coming. All right, you guys, thank you, Sam, so much, and we will see you guys next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.